Hey guys, welcome back to Builds by Maz. In today's video, I'll be showing you how I replaced this old furnace cover with a custom designed one made out of wood. This cover is easily removable and can be modified to fit any sized furnace or air conditioning vent. And I'll walk you through the whole process so you can do this yourself. Let's get started. My furnace was especially ugly because the top portion was covered by this mismatched grate, so the first thing to do was remove that. I then removed the actual furnace cover and took this opportunity to repaint everything around the outside, since we're already repainting the rest of our upstairs. Meanwhile, I removed the filter from this furnace cover because I'm going to be repainting it. I started off with a metal primer, which you can't really see here because it's white, but I let that dry and then followed it up with a couple of coats of black spray paint. This will make everything much less visible behind the slats of our new wooden vent cover. If you leave it white, it'll show through a lot more easily. While that was drying, I measured out the dimensions of this opening in the wall that would need to be fully covered. I transferred those measurements to a sheet of 1/4 inch plywood and cut the whole thing to size. I kept about 2 inches of overhang on the top and sides so it could be attached to the wall later on. I reinstalled the original furnace cover and test fit my newly cut sheet of plywood. This area up top can be fully covered, but starting from where the vent slats are, I needed to make sure that I allowed for proper airflow. To do that, I measured out and marked off this total vented area. I essentially marked off a large rectangle, which I'm going to be completely cutting out from this cover. Using a large drill bit, I drilled the hole within the rectangle's area, wide enough to allow me to place my jigsaw's blade within it. I then just traced the jigsaw along the marked edges of the rectangle. I repeated this process for all 4 edges of the rectangle until the whole thing was fully cut out. I did another test fitting to make sure that the cutout area lined up with the vents. This plywood comes from the store already pretty smooth, but I still give everything a quick sanding with 220 grit sandpaper. With the leftover plywood, I cut out a bunch of 2.5 inch strips which will act as slats on the new cover, spaced out to allow for proper airflow. I trimmed these all to the appropriate length, using the leg of my table as a stop block so that all these pieces were the exact same size. The slats will all lay across this rectangular opening just like this. These will all be attached using Titlebond 3 wood glue. It's extremely strong, and then you won't have any nail holes or other fasteners to cover up. All you need to do is position it correctly and clamp it tightly into place. After about 45 minutes, you can remove the clamps and attach the next piece. I glued either end and spread the glue out slightly before attaching. I also made sure to leave a 1/2 inch gap between each slat. I used 2 of my cutout pieces stacked together sideways to make this gap consistent. After securely clamping down either end, I could remove the middle spacer pieces while the glue dried. Be sure to also wipe up any excess glue before moving on to the next piece. From there, you can just repeat the same process, using the spacers to create a 1/2 inch gap and then gluing the next slat into place. I did about 3 of these at a time before removing the clamps and going on to the next section. You can adjust your slat width or the gaps between them depending on the size of your vents. For me, using 2.5 inch slats with a 1/2 inch gap between them allowed for plenty of airflow and fit my design perfectly. Here's how it looked once all the slats were glued into place. I then used some of this outside corner molding to cover up all the exposed edges. After measuring out the correct lengths, I cut the ends off at 45-degree angles. This way, the molding pieces from both edges can slide together perfectly. Once I was happy with how everything fit, I glued and clamped all the edges into place. I did the same thing for all 4 edges, clamping in as many spaces as possible. Once the slat edges were all covered, I used the same corner molding around the outside of the entire cover. I attached these in the same way, just gluing and clamping all 4 sides. With all the construction now complete, I put this cover back in front of the furnace and marked off the top and side edges with some masking tape. To hold the cover in place, I'm going to be using these magnets, which you can find a link to below in the video description. Using a Forstner bit slightly wider than the width of the magnet, I drilled into the drywall, checking until it was just deep enough so the magnet would be flush with the drywall surface. I installed these all around the border, keeping them 1 inch from the edge of the cover. This is why it's important to cut out your cover with additional margins on the side, so you have room to cover these magnets. I transferred the measurements of the position of these magnets to the back side of our furnace cover. From there I used super glue and attached some metal rings that came with the magnet set so the magnets have something to grab onto. I recommend this Gorilla super glue. It adheres really well and dries quickly. I just spread it out over the metal rings and then clamped it down for a few minutes, and it was rock solid. To add some warmer wood tones, I'm going to stain this whole thing. But first, I gave it all a coat of some pre-stained wood conditioner, which will help the stain go on more evenly. We're using this rustic wood effect stain, but you can use any color you want. You could also even paint it the same color as your wall to help it really blend in. But if you are using a stain, make sure to work in sections and wipe off any excess from the surface before it dries. I also added a couple of coats of matte polyurethane to protect the finish and the wood. I like using this triple thick formula. It's a little bit easier to work with and you don't need as many coats. I applied this to all the main surfaces of the cover, but it was tough to get into all these nooks and crannies along the edges. So for those, I used the same polyurethane, but in a spray finish. This stuff's really easy to apply, but it's a lot more expensive, so I try to only use it in places where I need it. Once that was dry, this new furnace cover was complete. To attach it, all I have to do is line it up with the magnets and it will stick to the wall. Overall, I was really happy with how this project turned out. It wasn't too much work, but it made a big difference to how this hallway looks. We've used it for a full winter and didn't have any issues with the airflow. It also really helped to quiet the sound of the furnace, which was a great added benefit. I hope you enjoyed the video, and be sure to subscribe to catch the next DIY home project.